In this video, we are going to be covering how to use and set up Xgen. Xgen is the hair system found in Maya, and it's an incredibly powerful system. It was originally designed at Disney for Tangled, and has now been integrated properly into Maya. So this is used in productions across the world and all sorts of things. And it's generally really powerful software, but keep in mind that it has a little bit of the Maya flair in it as well. So there are a lot of quirks in it, and it can be a little bit hard to get started with it. But once you know the quirks, it's pretty intuitive to work with. So before we get started with Xgen, the very first thing we have to do is we have to set our project. And like we remember from the project video, we do this under File and Set Project. And then I will go to my already ready-made project directory here. I just have it under my desktop. Now you should probably put this on somewhere more permanent, but just for sake of illustration, this works. So we just navigate to this location, and then we hit Set, and we create a default workspace. And then we go to File, and we go to Project window, and now you can see it's set right here. And then we just set this here to be, just go down here, make sure everything's ready, and then we hit Accept. Now the project has been set. Now we have to make sure the geometry we're using is correct as well. We have two pieces here. We have the scalp and we have the general body. Now this is just a sphere, nothing fancy here, and this is just a scalp of it. You can technically do the entire groom on one piece here. So we could do everything on this sphere and we could just mask out the areas we don't want. But that has some extra steps, and we want to keep this as simple as possible. So I really prefer to make like scalp geometry or just pieces of geometry for the different pieces I will have groom on. So make sure we name these correctly so you know what they are. And then we're ready to create our groom. Before we do that, let's just make sure our workspace is set to Xgen. This just makes it a bit easier for us because now we have some extra UI elements. Then we go to create description. And here we have two concepts we have to understand. The first one is a description, and the second one is a collection. So description is what specifically are you doing right now? In this case, this here is a scalp, and we call this description, underscore description. Whatever naming convention you use, that's fine. But as long as you use the same thing over and over again, and as long as it's clear what it is. Then the second one here is a collection, and this is a project. So this here is intro to Maya. We'll call this underscore col. This just keeps it nice and simple. It creates new nodes for us as well, like everything else. Then we can control how are the primitives made by their description, meaning like, do we have splines, groomable splines, custom geometry, whatever it might be. In this case, we want splines. Then we can set how it's going to be generating the primitives, meaning how it's going to generate in the groom. And we want this here to be set randomly across the surface. Now it's just going to be scattering them across. And then we want to set how are we actually controlling them. And we are going to do this by placing and shaping guides. This just means that we can control this perfectly. So now we hit create. Now you can see what happens is that it has now created a collection and then a description. And under here it has the scalp as well. So it has the selection points here. So in order to see our groom, we have to click at this eye icon here. So update the Xgen preview. And if you do that, you can see it says, hey, no preview visible. And this is because no guides have been created. So what we have to do first is we have to create guides. And we do this very easily with the add guides tool. So we can find this under here. We can also find it under the Xgen shelf as well. This here is quite handy. And we'll be using this a little bit, at least to get to the grooming tool. So we can just go here, add move guides. Now we can start to click on the surface. We can also change the size of this by holding on the B key. Just to scale up and down. And then we can just click where we want them to go. Let's just see here now. If we click on the eye icon, let's see what happens. So now you can see what's happening is that it starts to actually generate some hairs for us. It starts to generate some groomable splines here. Now it will interpolate between these two, and how many you have is also based on the density as well. So we can change this. So we can change the density here, and now you can see we get a lot more hair. But you can see we get a lot more hair than we have the groomable splines, and this is because it interpolates between these two. So you want to use as few guides as possible while still retaining this shape. This makes it very nice and easy to actually groom something without getting a crazy amount of splines, because it becomes very hard to actually control it once that happens. If you want to move these around, then you can do that by holding Control and middle mouse button. Now you can see I'm just dragging this around, and it just changes the spawn point of it. So we just have to go in and manually click on this to reflect the updates. You can click here, and you can now see that this actually interpolates between these two. It doesn't make it go out of the normal, it actually interpolates between these two, between the grooms or the splines which have already been put down. We can now select one of the splines here, and we can just start to rotate them around. And now you can see that if we hit the eye icon, it's going to start interpolating between these two. So it's really cool that you can select them and you can rotate, and you can also scale them up and down. Also, if we go under the collection, if you hit the Shift key, we open up this hierarchy all the way down. So Shift key, now you can see all the way down. And here we have the different guides. So if you need to ever access the different guides, which you often do, we can very easily do that by just clicking down here as well. It can sometimes be a bit tricky to actually select them. You might have many things, and here in the background, for instance, we have a light, so it can be a bit hard to actually sometimes select them properly. So then selecting the guides here is a pretty good idea. So then we can rotate them around, and we can update. So the density here is really important. This is really what determines how many guides there are going to be in your scene. Then we also have the length. We really don't want to touch this one, at least not in our case. What this will do, this will take the current length of one of our splines here, and it will just make it longer. So now you can see it actually becomes longer or shorter. The reason we don't want to touch this is because now it becomes hard to actually groom this, because now if we were to modify one of these guys here now, we wouldn't actually control the length directly through this. We would control it through this attribute here. So I highly recommend you to leave the length to 1. And then if you want to scale it up and make it longer, you use the scale tool. Very nice and easy. So now you can see it actually becomes longer based on this. Then we also have the width as well. So here you can set this way thicker or way thinner. We usually want to stick to something really, really thin if we're doing human hair at least. And this is based on the scene scale. So now you can see a bit better what we're doing, and now you can see that we need a crazy density compared to this. We need a much higher density in this, so we can set this to like 1,000, and now you can see what's going on. This gets a bit heavy afterwards if you don't have a crazy powerful computer, but with these kind of grooms, it's not at all a problem. And you can always just take density up and down based on this. And every number you're seeing here, even though it might be set to 1,000 as the maximum, you can always change that to something else. We can always set this to, even if the maximum is 1,000, we can still set this to 10,000 if we want to. You need as many hairs as you need. That just depends on your project. If you're doing a highly realistic human, you just need them as many hairs as you need. You can't really go like, oh, but my computer is a little bit slow. Well, the character still needs as many hairs as the character needs. Then we have the modifier CV count. This is not relevant right away, but this becomes very important when we're dealing with modifiers. This is essentially how many points does each one of these curves have, each one of these guides have. So if you right click on it now, I just isolate selected, Control 1 by clicking on it, right click, and then we do guide point control. Now you can see that we have 4 points here. This means we can go in and we can start to modify each hair like this. But what it means when we're using modifiers is that we'll create a lot more of these. We still can't access them in the viewport, but when we're doing something like a noise to them to really break it up, we can very clearly see a completely different effect if we have a high number or not. Something like 5 is way, way too low. And it's going to look just completely different based on a high or low number. Then we can set the taper as well. If we set the width to be a bit higher and we set the density down a little bit, then you can see a lot more what width is doing. What taper is doing. So we set the taper here, the taper start to be something like 0.8. 0.8. And then we set the taper amount here to be something like this as well, 0.8. This is usually a good number for human hair. And now you can see that this actually tapers it down at the center. or at the end here. So this makes it a bit more extreme. So this is also where does the taper start. You can set it from all the way in the beginning, but I find that it's better if you put it something like 0.8. 0.8 is usually pretty decent, and then you set the taper amount to 0.8 as well. I was a bit confused by this in the beginning because I didn't really understand the difference between these two. But taper start simply shows where on the curve does it start, and taper amount, which is this one, is how much does it taper in and out. So it's just kind of random that these two are the same value. They really could be completely different values. Now let's set the density all the way up again. Do something a lot more, let's set maybe like 3000. And then we can set the width down all the way as well. So we have something which is a bit easier to work with. It's also a good idea to enable the anti-aliasing here, because otherwise it gets very hard to see what's actually going on. Let's set the density down just a little bit, so a bit easier to see what's going on. So now we can start to groom these here as well. So now it's time to start to groom the splines here, and we can do this with this tool up here. This is called Sculpt Guides. Now, one thing which is a good idea is that you see this guy to the right here. This is called Convert Primitives to Polygons, which means it's going to actually convert everything to polygons, and you might accidentally click it. So what you should do, you should middle mouse button and drag it as far away as possible. Once you drag that guy really far away, there's not really any chance you're not going to accidentally screw up your entire groom. So now we can hit Sculpt Guides. And now you can see what happens when we hover over one of these guys. Actually, let's just hide the light. It's a bit annoying that it's here. Just hit H on the light. Now we can go back here. So now you can see that we can actually start to groom this like so. We can start to just move it around, and we can start to actually shape it. And then once we're done with our shape, we just hit the little eye icon. And this is where you can use a big or a small brush size as well. If you want a really big brush size, you hold on the B key and you just drag it up and down, or you can hold on the Shift key as well to drag it up and down. And then we can just start to just groom it. It's generally a good idea to hold at the end, because then everything just follows along based on that. Or if you want to just really shape it like so, we can also do that as well. We can shape it in the middle. And now we can hit the eye. And you can see, now everything is crazy because we haven't done any shaping of this whatsoever. So, everything is super messy right now, but that's okay because now we can see we get a quite crazy groom with only a few curves. So it really interpolates in between these. So like I said, you want to use as few guide points as possible, or as few guides as possible, but you also, you still need more than 4. If you're doing a proper groom, you really need more than 4 points. You need quite a lot of guides. The point is just that you want to have as few as possible. So let's try to actually make a nice little groom here. I'm going to try to make like a little spiraling hair. We're still just on a ball here, but I'm going to try to just make something which looks a little bit nicer than this. So I'm going to try to make something which goes like this, and it kind of spirals around itself. Almost like if ZBrush is like a snake hook brush effect. So I'm just going to try to do that. Now you can see all these are the same length, apart from this one, which we've already scaled up. So we can also do that as well. We can also just select the guide manually and just scale it up. I'll sometimes do that where I'll just go in here and I'll just go into selection tool, just so I'm not in the groom tool or in the sculpt tool. Then we can just scale it up or down depending. This is also actually an excellent case of why you want to use layers. This is something I should have done actually. Should have selected these two, and then we should hit Control A, go into display layers down here, and click on this button here, which is create a new layer based on the objects. So now we have a new layer. Then we can hit this guy here, set this to R, and now we can't select this. So now we can only select the actual guides, which makes it very nice and easy to select something. Just scale this up, go back to Xgen. Now we can start to click here. And now you can see that this updates right away. We can use the rotate tool to rotate this into place like so. And the way you get a nice groom is honestly just by sculpting this. This takes some time, but you just have to spend the time it takes to get a nice result. I tend to get as far, I tend to try to get as far as possible by using as few guides as humanly possible, but you do have to simply add guides afterwards as well. One thing which I believe I forgot to mention in the beginning is that also your base model also requires UVs. So for the scalp here, I have just created some very quick UVs. So you can see here, this is literally just like a planar project which has been unfolded. This is just so we have some UVs. For this kind of work, this is not needed at all, but we do have to create some, we do have to paint some maps at some point. And when we do that, we will have to actually have UVs. Just move this, rotate this around. You can see that the gizmo goes a bit weird, or the guide actually goes a bit weird. Once you release it, it's fine again. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, so I want to add another guide here. And then we click and drag. And you can see now it interpolates between the two. So it's not going to have a set length. It's going to interpolate between these two. So if you put it down here, you see it also has a different length. So we're just going to add a few guides just so we can actually get the shape we want. And then we can hit the eye icon, and then we can see our groom a bit better. We can click on the guide next to it, which is just clear the Xgen preview. So now it's a bit easier to see what's actually going on in terms of the pure guides as well. Then we can select this, and I just want to shape this so that it goes a little bit around each other. We can also use the sculpt guides tool as well here. And if we go to the options, you can see there is one called lock length. And what this will do is it will actually lock the length. So if this is disabled, then we can just start to drag it out and we can change the length of the actual segment. One thing to be aware of here is that now we're actually scaling out the last point of it so that the last point becomes incredibly long. So it is often a good idea to enable lock length and then scale it up uniformly using the scale tool. So I prefer to scale the guides up like so, and then I use the sculptor tool to really sculpt the guides. You can also set the size to be fairly low so that you only affect one guide at a time. If this is set to a high number, now you can see it affects all of them at one time, which can be nice if you want to actually uniformly groom everything, but I really prefer to control it by only grooming like one portion at a time. So now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make these kind of spiral around just a little bit so that they will just create this nice little twist going around it. So you might have to actually just drag it for a little ride to get the shape you want, and it can be a bit tricky to actually get the shape. This is just practice. This is just a tool you just have to get used to, and it's very similar to sculpting. The more you understand of sculpting form, the better this is going to be. And I'm trying to make this not go through the surface either. So I'm trying not to make it go into the surface like this and actually go over the surface. The cool thing here is it actually preserves the length of it. So if you're moving this point here, you can see that the tip actually changes as well. Okay, let's see what this looks like. So now we're getting a bit more shape into it, but I still want there to be more overlap. So let's make some more overlap. And this just takes a bit of practice to get right. Okay, let's review again. I want one more guide down here. So let's just add another guide just so I can control this a bit better. And then I want one guide here as well. And the reason is because now it is actually going through the surface. So I really just want to control this so that this here doesn't go through the surface. So I would just want to force the guide in a little bit. But the fundamentals here is very similar to sculpting in the way that you start simple and you only add new pieces, new guides whenever you need actual more control here. It's kind of like subdividing if you're used to sculpting, where you only add more resolution the moment you actually need those new shapes. Okay, let's review again. Okay, so we have a pretty cool shape here now. Maybe we can just put it a little bit closer here so we get a bit more of a spiky shape. But in general, we are almost there. Actually, let's just add one more guy here just so we have a bit more control. And you can use control middle mouse button to move it around if you just want to move it a little bit. And then we go back to our sculpt tool. This is a really nice tool, the sculpt guides tool. And then let's review. So now we have a really cool shape, which we are controlling quite easily. And we have just a few guides, not too many. We have 11 guides, and we can now just make a pretty cool shape from this. Now what we can do, we can create a density map, because we don't really want groom everywhere. We don't necessarily want the hair to go from everywhere. So we can create a density map for this, and we can do this if we go to density and then mask, and you see here we have a little drop down. If we click the triangle, we can create map, and this creates a new mask for us. Now the map resolution, this is by actually using PTEX, which is a completely different technology than UVs. This is also one of these weird Disney technologies, which exists in some software and is supposed to replace UVs, but didn't. But it is used in Xgen. So this is one of the reasons we need UVs, because we're actually painting on our UVs, and then it's being converted to PTEX. So we can just hit create by default. Now you can see this here actually brings up the 3D paint tool. So now I can actually paint in 3D. I bet you didn't think that you can actually paint textures in Maya. Well, you can, it's just a bit crappy. So we just want to make sure that we don't paint too many textures in Maya. But for these kind of maps, it's fine. If I double click it, now you can see we get the tool settings. Now we can dock this over here, and we can also just hide the outliner. We don't really need that. There are a few things we have to be aware of when we are dealing with the paint tool here. We really want to make sure that after we have painted, we hit save textures. If not, it's not actually going to save the texture. It might look fine in the viewport, but if you close down Maya and open it up again, your groom is going to be all wrong because it didn't actually save this to file. So that's really important. We can also go up here, and now we can see the different settings we have. For this tool, it's fine to have a gradient, but for other tools, it's really not fine to have a gradient. So now we can just start to paint. I'm actually using a tablet for this video, which is lucky. And now we can start to paint the map here. And let's preview this, and you can see that nothing actually happens. And there are two reasons why this doesn't happen. The first one is that we haven't actually saved our texture. So let's do that, and let's see what happens. And nothing happens. What this did, this just saved the texture to disk. And you can see down here, it actually stored in the project directory under source images and 3D pen textures, and it creates an IFF map. But the second one is that we haven't actually saved the texture to a PTEX. We haven't converted this data to a PTEX. So we do that if we go over here, and then we hit the save icon. And now you can see that the density is actually affected by this. So now if we hit save here, the thing is you can just hit save here. That's also fine. But like I said, this will not be saved whenever you close and open Maya. So it's important you click save here, and then you hit save here for everything we're doing. So this is how you can create a density map. So like we said in the beginning, it is a bit easier to use a separate piece of geo. But let's say you have a head and you want hair on top. You could just paint a density map for it as well. But regardless, you probably want a density map at some point. You hit save. Just make sure this is properly painted through. We can also set this to a really hard brush like so. And we can just paint across the border down here just so we make sure we don't have any weird strays. Hit save. And now you can see that some of these disappeared because there were some tiny little values which we couldn't really see, but they were there. So we just got to make sure that if you see these kind of weird things, it's not actually a Maya bug or anything like that. It's not a distribution which doesn't work. It's purely that you haven't told Maya to not have geometry there. And save. And again, hit save here as well. You should really hit save here first and then hit save here. And now we can also do set this to a gradient. And the advantage of having a gradient here is that this is really how hair will look if you want to make this nice and organic. That the very edges of the hair is a lot softer than where they're actually spawning from in the center. So it's a really good idea to have a nice gradient here. You can also set density a lot higher so you can see what's going on. So if we now were to paint a nice gradient, and we save, just get into the habit of that, you can now see that we have like an actual gradient going on. If you want to change the color, we can do that here. So now we can actually just get a nice gradient, save and save. Save and save. But in this case, I'm just going to force in where it goes. So we can just set this back to 1. And then we can just paint this in. Then we hit save and we hit save. So this is really how we control the density of our groom. Pretty nice and simple. We can also flood this if we want to. For instance, if we need to flood the entire thing, instead of going over and just painting everything here, we can just hit flood paint, and that's going to flood the entire thing. So now if we hit save and save, now you can see what happens, or we can do the opposite as well. So with black, everything disappears. It's like with a regular mask, everything disappears with black, and everything appears with white. Just flood, and then we hit save. Now the reason I'm not always clicking save and save is because I'm still within the same Maya scene. I'm not closing and opening it, but it's still a good idea to hit save and save. So for this case, it doesn't really matter a whole lot, because in this case, it's just a sphere. It's not a huge concern if this here is painted correctly. This is just an example scene, but if you are doing something like a scalp or whatever it might be, it's a very good idea to use a density map, like so. It can also be cool if you're trying to create some variation, just by painting a bit like this, just painting a bit of like up and down, just to make like a line a little bit wobbly. It just makes it a bit more organic. In general, it's a good idea to keep stuff nice and organic. So cool. So now we can see this works. We can also create region maps as well. Now we aren't actually going to be using them for this series, but it's really nice to know how to do that. This just means that different areas will adhere more to different curves. Imagine you have a haircut and you want the left side of the hair to go to left and right side of the hair to go to right, like to have a split in the center. This is how you would do that. And we do this if we go to region mask. And down here, this is where we can set the region. It's actually set the region map, and then we do the same thing as before. We go to the little triangle, we hit create map, and this does the exact same thing here. Now we can just hit create map like so, and then we can start to paint. Now with this one, it's really important that you paint with 100% hard brush, that you paint like this, because Maya gets weird when it deals with like gradients, when it deals with interpolation between the different values. So if we want to actually paint with a gradient or paint with a region map, we really have to make sure that we use a hard brush. You also have to paint with a color. It's general advice to use the different colors up here. You can see it's already flooded with red, but it's a really good idea just to keep it to the basic colors we have up here. Now, for instance, we can paint this area here to be perfectly yellow, and then we're going to hit save here and hit save here. And then we can update it, and you can see nothing is happening, and that's because we have to enable the region mask. And now you can see that it becomes very much its own region. So this determines how much of the mask is affected. And we can also create different regions as well. If, for instance, we want one area here to really be its own region, we can do that. We can go here and we can set this to, don't create a custom color, make this blue, like this. And then we can make these guys here their own color, save and save. And now you can see that they very much become their own color. So again, this is used very much with parting of hair. In this case here, this is not practical because now we just completely screwed up our nice little groom, but this is something you would use a fair bit. So a good example of this would be where you would have, for instance, half the groom like this, because this will go to one side and the other half will go to the other side, where you would have it be a clear split like so. And here you can see there is no interpolation whatsoever. It's only hard pixels like so. And this is also the reason why we go back and forth between these colors, because now it's really easy to go back to the color, which was here before. I don't have to color pick and don't get any interpolation in between. So it becomes very easy to actually paint if we just use these default colors. We can hit save, and then we can hit save down here as well. And there you can see, now we have 2 regions. But in our case, we want to just disable this, set region mask to 0, because this is terrible and we just destroyed all the nice grooming we had. We can really control a lot of things with the maps here, because now we can very quickly go in and we can paint a mask for density, and we can control a map for the region as well. Then we'll look into modifiers. Now, at this point, we don't really need these guides anymore, because now we're just going to be dealing with actual modifiers to control the rest. So we can hide them by hitting this icon here, and this will hide the actual guides. So now we don't really need them. So now we can create modifiers, and using modifiers is a really clever way of adding more procedural control over your groom. The first step of grooming is to create a nice groom using guides. The second step is to really break it up using modifiers. I really recommend that you don't just add modifiers right away. It's very important that you make it nice and solid using proper grooming tools. We create modifiers by clicking on the plus icon here. And the very first one we're going to be talking about, we're really only going to be talking about 2, is clumping. And then the second one is noise. So clumping is super powerful. This is really like the master modifier of them all. You can do so many things with it. So what we have to do in order to make this work, we have to create clump maps. So you can see here nothing is actually happening when we enable and disable this. And we do this if we go to setup maps all the way on the bottom. And then we can create generate guides. This will generate clumping guides. We can set density to be a lot higher. We can generate, and now we can create a lot more density maps or clump maps. And then we can hit save. And now you can see what happens. Now, because of the guides we created, we now have clumping. And clumping just means that we have a collection of hair, and these will now be clumped based on the clump guides. So here you can see, we can now set the density up and down, hit generate, and this will generate them all across the model. And we can, let's set this back to 1. We're going to generate, and then we hit save, and now you can see it changes based on that. So a high density gives you really like a high amount of clumps, and a low amount will give you a really low amount. So if we set this to 3, generate, now you can see that we get a lot fewer of these spikes like this. If we were to show our guides now again, a really cool technique is that we can also go to setup maps, and then we can set this to guide. And now it's going to actually create one clump guide per guide. So now you can see here we have 1 per guide. So then we just hit generate, guide, and then we hit save. Now you can see what happens. Each one of these guides will now be clumping like so. So this is also really powerful if you really want to control it with the guides. But I prefer to not do it like this. I prefer to use just a general amount of clumping guides like so. And then we can generate, hit save, like so. And this becomes very powerful because now we can actually change the curvature of them as well. And we can just do all sorts of crazy things to them here. You can see how much do you want to turn into a spike at the end. And so you can really make them not turn into a spike, and you can really change the base, how thick and thin the base is. You can add points here as well. So you can just control this in really interesting ways. To delete a point, you just click on the little X below it, like so. We can also add noise to it as well, which is really handy. So we set the noise amount to 1, and obviously nothing has happened because we haven't created any curves to it yet. So now we can just go in here and we can start to create some nice noise breakup in our actual curves. We can also change the frequency, so this is something like 10. And this is where it becomes important what we talked about earlier, where now we can't really see anything because we can't really see differences in frequencies because we haven't gone to primitives and we haven't changed the modifier CV count. So if we change this to something like 30 now, there we go, I accidentally set it to 530. Set this to 30, you can see this changes drastically. So it's really important to have a good amount of CVs for the count here. Set this to 5, you can see how it changes. And we set this to 10, you can see how it drastically changes. And the reason this changes is because essentially we're getting more information. It's like trying to have a noise map in Photoshop if your document is like 20 by 20 pixels versus 1000 by 1000 pixels. So now you can really go crazy here. So this becomes really important. It's crazy important that you set this to a good amount early on. Otherwise you will have to redo your entire stack because nothing is actually going to fit. So now we can just start to change this. The more left we go, the more we are to root, and the more right we go, the more we are to tip. So now, for instance, we can say that here's a value of 0, and here's a value of 1. So we see at the root, nothing happens. And then we can see at the tip, a lot of things happen. Or we can just break it up a little bit like so. And we can also change the frequencies. Change the frequency to 1, set it to 2, and we just get a bit more breakup in this. Like so. What's also cool is we use multiple clumping modifiers on top of each other. So we can do, let's just see what this was set to. This was set to density of 10. So now we can do another one, which is set to a lot higher, just to get a lot more breakup in this. So we can make another clumping modifier. So we can set this to clumping. And again, nothing will happen, and we'll get this nice little error message. And then we go to setup maps. And we set the density now to something like 30. That was not 30, 30. Generate, and you can see it's a lot higher density. Then we hit save. And you can see that we get a lot more breakup like this. Turn it on and off like this. And we can really just get some crazy cool breakup like so. You can set it even higher as well. Set this to something like 60. Generate. Hit save. And now you just see we get this really awesome breakup. And again, we can go into the noise effect, and we can set this to 1. And again, nothing will have happened because there's, well, 0 frequency, 0 amount here. We just set this up. So now there's going to be uniform noise across the entire thing. We can set this to 1. Now you can just see we get a really nice breakup on everything. But I want this to be more apparent at the very tips. So let's do that. Click here at the end to actually make a point. Now you can see it affects the end far more than it affects the root. So the frequency is something like 5, and that was a bit too much. But now you get this really nice hair. So we can set this to 2. And there we go. What's cool about this is we can still change our guides. So if we go back to our guides, we can still change this to where we want to. We can select one of the guides. We can go under the guide tool like this, and we can start to modify them around. We can just start to change it. So this is a really nice and procedural way of actually changing our groom, because now we're using modifiers to really do the breakup, and we're using guides to do the heavy lifting of the actual shape. Like so. Let's hide the guides again, and then we can see what's going on. And then we can add noise on top of this. A noise will just do a more general noise to everything. We'll just do a more general breakup. So it's a bit different from the noise we have here, which is the noise on the actual clumps. The other noise will do a noise on everything. So we do another modifier. We add another modifier here. Then we set this to noise. And now you can see everything goes crazy. And this is because it's set to 1 in the mask. This is essentially how much of it is enabled. Set this to 0, it's going to be disabled. Set it back to 1, it's enabled. And also, it's now going to mostly affect the tips here. So we just set this down. We can just break this up a little bit like so. So if you really want like nice, messy here, this is a really good way of doing that. So I just want a little bit of noise going on here, just to break up the entire thing, just a little bit. This is very much like just see what looks good. And then we set the mask intensity down to 0.2, just so we have a little bit of it. Set the frequency to 5. Then we can just start to play around with this. So by adding this at the end, you can see it now just opens up a little. If you don't want that, you just set this back. Now, if this happens to you, if everything goes a bit crazy, then we can just hit the eye icon. So sometimes Xgen goes a bit crazy. So if that happens, sometimes you just have to go out of, you just have to enable and disable. Sometimes you have to restart Maya. Sometimes you have to actually just kill your preferences. Before recording this, I actually had to delete my preferences because it just didn't work the way I wanted to. But I digress. Now you can see if we set this all the way back to 0, now you can see that it gives us a really nice breakup around here. So there's nothing in the beginning, then it does something in the middle, and then again it does nothing in the actual tips as well. And we control the amount by up here. So this is a really cool way of actually creating a lot of variation very quickly. If you go back to our original groom like this, it looks super boring. It looks like somebody has used an iron board on hair and tons of spray. Then we use clumping just to break up the clumps. Then we use another clumping just to go a bit crazy with this. Then we use some noise just to break it up a little bit like so. Now I'm just going to save this because I don't trust Maya and I think it will crash at some point. Now when we assign shaders to this, we have to assign a proper shader. This shader here is perfectly fine for the viewport, but it's not really optimized for rendering, and it's a very primitive shader. So we select the description here, and then we right mouse button, assign new material, and then we go to Arnold. And here we have a shader called AI Standard Hair. Click on this one, and now you can see it turns all black, and that's by design. We can change this shader around. We can change the melanin levels, which is what actually changes the hair color. This is a very physically based shader. You could, of course, plug a color into this, but the point here is that we want to stay as physically plausible as possible. So now we go and we do render. Now you can see we have a pretty physically plausible result. Obviously, the lighting is terrible. There is no specularity in it, and it just doesn't look great. But at least it renders our actual shape. And you have a lot of control over this. So if you change this, you want this more blonde, you can set the melanin level down. Or if you want this darker, we set the melanin levels all the way up. You can also change the redness of it as well. But we're really getting ahead of ourselves. Now, we aren't really going to cover this shader properly later on because this is a very specific use case for it. But we just want to show that this shader is the one you actually use for rendering inside of Arnold when it comes to it. Now, in order to improve this result, clearly we'll groom this properly and, make sure this is exactly to the taste we want. But regardless of what you're doing, if you're doing some super crazy groom or you're doing something more simple, this is pretty much the technique. So let's just quickly run through it. The first thing we do is we create a description and a collection. Make sure we name them. We also work on the Xgen workspace. And then we have all the Xgen tools right here. We preview our groom by clicking this guy here, and we update it like this, and we disable it like so. The scalp geo we're using needs to have UVs. So very quick UVs, doesn't have to be fancy at all. Then under primitives, we have to make sure that we have our density set to an appropriate amount. And we can also create a density mask as well for this. Then under the primitive attributes, we have to make sure that we have a decent amount of CV counts for our actual curves. Otherwise, it's not going to render properly, or rather, the deformers are not going to work whatsoever. Length, leave this alone. Make sure to scale up the curves the guides using the scale tool. Width, set this to something pretty low. You really don't want hair to be thick. Hair is very thin. Taper, 0.8 and 0.8 is a pretty good way of doing it. Region mask, this is where we control actually the region of it. So if you have like one side of the hair go to one side, then we use a region mask for it. On the modifiers, we will use a clump to create some basic variation. You can break it up more with more clumps. Then under noise, then we can really break it up even further. And when we are rendering out, we just have to make sure that the render is set to Arnold and that we select the actual description. This is also why we name our stuff so methodically. And we assign a shader to this. A little tip as well, which we didn't actually mention, is that we have a little slider here, which is the preview amount. So you can set this to 1%, and now it's only going to display 1% of the hair, but it's going to render all of them. So now you can see we have a very low amount of hair in the viewport, so it's very, very light to actually work with, and we have a really thick groom in the actual render. And then once we assign a shader, we just have to make sure to use the Arnold hair shader. We also use the sculpt guides tool to actually sculpt the guides, and we use the add guides tool to actually add guides to it. And make sure before anything to set the project. So Xgen is incredibly powerful. There are just some quirks you have to be aware of. So once you get used to it, you can do all sorts of awesome hairstyles with it, and it's so much fun to play around with.